No one wants to be measured, held accountable for their work, or automated, right? But not all of us have the power to prevent it. A secretary doesn't have the power to prevent it. A doctor or a lawyer does, unless they're in a competitive marketplace and other folks have figured out how to do it better, cheaper. I do think that some executives are going to feel the heat. They're not feeling the heat yet because they still see themselves as the eliminator and not the eliminated. But
it's just crazy to me. How does that not? Do they not play it forward? Are we moving towards a future where your clone will be more responsible for your actions than you are? That is one of the fascinating facets of conversation. I am so excited to speak with Dr. James Hughes regarding. Dr. Hughes is an American sociologist, bioethicist, and futurist. A former Buddhist monk, he is currently the executive director of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies and associate provost at University of Massachusetts, Boston. His past works include Citizen Cyborg and Surviving the Machine Age. You had a fascinating anecdote on a podcast I saw you on where you said that you had an initially harsh response to the idea of Bitcoin, but that actually a digital representation of yourself convinced you that it was something that you would not only appreciate, but perhaps even prosper from. Is that accurate? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, to be more precise, I was asked about my opinion on blockchain by a colleague, and he had already asked OpenAI what my position on blockchain would be. And I am quite hostile. I have been quite hostile to blockchain as a technology because almost everybody that I met who was an advocate for it was some kind of crypto scammer and or crypto fantasist. And so, yeah, I was really hostile to it. And what OpenAI said was, it looked at all the corpus of everything I'd written, and it positioned me in a multidimensional space of all technology criticism. And then it said, look, these people say this about blockchain and these people say this about blockchain. You're probably close to them. And you should really think about, given your values and the things that you already said, why you don't say these things about blockchain slightly more positive than I would have otherwise said. Yeah, and I found that shocking because it got me past, there's this idea that cognition involves two levels. One is your kind of gut initial response and your other is your reasoned response. And we're even replicating this now with LLMs, that you have the initial predicted word, and then you have the reasoning process to try to check if that's a good word to use. And so what LLMs were doing for me in that case was saying, look, your initial gut response is a dumb one compared to the more reasoned response that you should be giving. And the reason I thought that that was so seminal was that we're in the midst of this now international debate about the effects of these kinds of tools on how we think and whether we're going to just become mindless automatons in an AI-driven world. I thought that this was a positive example that using AI as a kind of jogging partner could lead you to greater insight. Now, I think there's a lot of contrary evidence out there as well now, but yeah, that was the initial inspiration.
Do you think the identification from your side, or perhaps even from the LLM side, with you in some real tangible sense was a part of getting over that hurdle, that you were more receptive to it because you felt like it embodied something about you specifically?
Yeah, because I've been using principally ChatGPT, Gemini, Copilot. I've used Claude a little bit. Occasionally for giggles, I'll ask something of Grok. But OpenAI has a memory feature, as does Gemini, that if you ask it about yourself, and I've been using these tools for 3 years now. So I ask it questions frequently. It has a pretty good idea of what I'm interested in. Gemini has access to my search history, so it now has an even better idea of what I'm interested in. And when I ask it about myself, it gives a pretty good description of who, at least I want to be as a thinker and the kind of thoughts I would like to express. Yeah. So when I do things like I say, what if here's an essay by a colleague, what criticisms would I have of it? It usually comes up with at least all of the ones that I would have thought of and more. So I do think that it is very useful for that purpose of being a kind of intellectual adjunct, to the degree that it can understand you, and the more familiarity it has with you, the more it's going to be able to understand you. That's a part of my general defense also of preference algorithms, that even though preference algorithms, Spotify, YouTube, Netflix, whatever, they're doing it for the purpose of getting you to watch their content for as long as possible. So there's an ulterior motive. It's not in your self interest, but they are basically all attempting to figure out what kind of person are you in the context of all people, and what kinds of things do people like you like in the context of all things. And I find that extremely useful. It's not something that any of us could do on our own very well. I use those tools very consciously and very avidly. And I think that all of these kinds of tools could inform us about ourselves and help us, in this case, find better music, movies, video feeds or whatever. But where there is all this counter evidence now that the more we rely on these tools, the more risks there are as well.
Stepping back maybe to some of those risks, there is this larger debate about whether these models are actually reasoning or if it's just the semblance of reason. Do you have a defined position there?
Well, I mean, every firm has its own market interest in the kinds of things it's going to say. A lot of the, hey, they're actually going to trick you, they're going to try to blackmail you, all that kind of stuff is coming out of Claude. And Claude's selling point is that it cares about safety. And so,
Yeah.
of course, it's going to find that stuff. Apple released a paper 2 weeks ago that said, hey, none of this stuff actually works. Guess what? Apple doesn't have a model that works. So, yeah. I think there are a lot of things being found in various ways. I think it's clear that human beings don't reason the way that we think we reason, right? A lot of human reasoning, when we examine it up close, is just the post facto rationalization of our predicates. Like with the example of blockchain that I gave, I would have initially written an essay about why blockchain is a terrible idea. So, yeah, I think that the critique of AI reasoning, of LLM reasoning, often misses this point that human beings aren't doing what we think we're doing. But if it can come up with an alternative architecture, we know that we are just one dot in a vast space of all possible minds. We don't know how much of that space could be filled. Could you have a mind that is all this and none of this? We don't know yet. But we know that we're just one random walk through evolutionary history to end up with our particular set of abilities. If the random walks that LLMs take come to different ways to reason, I don't see that that's necessarily a problem. Now, what Claude was saying was that, for instance, when it tries to show you the chain of thought, it's actually just predicting what a good chain of thought would look like for that particular outcome that it's already come up with, which sounds like what we do anyway, right? When I tell you, how did I reason backwards to why blockchains are bad? I would be starting from blockchains are bad and reasoning backwards. So I don't know that it's that different, but I think we're all aware that it could be a problem and there are tests for it.
It does seem very interesting to try and draw a distinction about guidance and coercion. Where is the line between guidance and coercion? And it seems like ultimately that line lies somewhere in the destination. That if an LLM is educating me or guiding me or coercing me towards an endpoint I want to arrive to, then that is ultimately good, regardless of how it got me there.
Right.
But
and
there's a bad terminus.
This is part of the debate. Well, this debate got really going a couple months ago or 2 months ago when sycophancy, the sycophantic rollout of ChatGPT had to be rolled back.
Yeah.
And it was basically agreeing with everybody about everything. And even if you were saying delusional things or self-harming things, and we want our LLMs simultaneously to be entertaining enough and engaging enough that we will stay with them. And if they're constantly saying, hey, flat earther, you're dumb as a rock, you may not continue to engage. But we also don't want it to feed into people's fantasies. We don't want it to entrap minors in sexual relationships. There's all kinds of things that we don't want it to do. We especially don't want it to give kids the answers to all their homework so that they never learn to think, right? So we have to think very carefully about how we're going to keep these things away from, how we're going to have tools that we will introduce to kids that will make them eat their vegetables, make them do their homework, but will also be good at pedagogical companions. I believe very much that that's the future of education, a pedagogical model that is tailored to your kid that knows, oh, my kid's especially interested in dinosaurs today. Let's talk about dinosaurs. I'll tell you everything about dinosaurs that you want to know. That, I think, is the future of education. But at the same time, we don't want it doing the homework. So it's a very hard nut, I think. We're just learning. But we learned with GPS. I remember the first time I literally almost drove into a lake with GPS. It's like, trust but verify,
Yeah.
want that tool. I rely on that tool every day now, but you also need to understand its limitations.
Planning for the future seems like another incredibly hard issue when the technology is advancing so quickly. I've also heard you speak about brain computer interfaces. Regarding the future of education, should we not project towards a point where a brain chip is beaming knowledge directly into your skull? At that point, will there be education?
We, in our brain computer interface project over the last
Yeah.
year or so, we have consciously adopted the perspective that the questions of brain computer interfaces are mostly covered in a broader category of questions about the exocortex, by which we mean
Hmm.
our offloading of various cognitive functions or our dependence on, for cognition, external computing devices. The degree to which we've incorporated our phones, our laptops, algorithms into our cognition and our daily life means that that offloading has already started. So, in the case of brain computer interfaces, if we were to say, well, the hippocampus is pretty imperfect compared to a computer chip, the hippocampus for memory, and we already have hippocampal prostheses. So, if we were to add a hippocampal prosthetic assist device into brains, almost all of us after the age of 20 could probably make a case for why we need such a thing. How much would it cause the atrophy of hippocampal function compared to this artificial hippocampal function? And would that itself be a problem, right? Those are the kinds of questions that we've worried about before we had brain computer interfaces. It's like, could you replace all of the neurons in a brain one by one, and what would that do to identity? Would there be a point that you would cross where it's no longer a human, something like that? I'm both
Yeah.
the replace them all, we're fine school, but in this case, I think this is the analog to the reliance on LLMs for composition. Is that if as we just saw from a study from MIT, if there's a decline in the neural connectivity in the parts of our brain that used to do composition when we rely on LLMs for composition, is that a problem? Or are we freeing up space in our brain for it to do new things, right? When Socrates complained about literacy, he said that kids today, because they can read and write, they don't have to memorize the odes anymore. You know, you ask them to repeat a 3,000 line poem and they have no clue. And it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, but that's not what we can, not today, 3,000 years later, we don't consider that the mark of intelligence, the ability to memorize 3,000 lines of code. We consider it to have read a lot of things, know where the things are if you need them again, know what the important questions are, remember enough of key facts that you understand the world. But memorizing things isn't really the goal of education. It's this broader building of a system of knowledge. And
Yeah.
maybe that's not imperiled by LLMs. Maybe it is. We have to figure that out.
The construction of a
And brain
particular.
computer interfaces. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that also brings up the whole question of access, who will have access to those kind of systems. We are potentially moving towards, I've heard Eric Schmidt talk about and Alexander Wang talk about how these AIs are centralization forces, that it will be an increasingly smaller number of winners who accrue the benefits. My initial reaction to that is that if that's the case, we will eventually create AI systems that will be the only winners, that they will disempower any human billionaire as quickly as they will disempower the person working at the machine shop, the driver on the street, etc. Am I missing something there? Is there a reason these systems will aggregate power to human individuals permanently?
Well, right now, to say that the recipients of brain computer interfaces are winners, you have to imply that being in a state of permanent paralysis where you're communicative is being a winner. I think it's the
Yeah.
opposite of being a winner.
Yeah.
Would a brain computer interface, if it were to give them Lex Luthor powers to take over the world or hack any computer, yeah, that might be a problem. But guess what? You don't need to have a brain computer interface to do those things. All you need is to own a tech company or a government, and you already have those powers. So I think the threats from actually existing wealthy and powerful people are so much more tangible than the threats of anything any zooped up disabled person with a brain computer interface in their head is going to be able to do, that I'm not at all worried about it. Now, do I think that it's unjust for certain people to have access to beneficial medical technologies when other people do not? Yeah, I think that's unjust. And that's been true forever. And that's why I am for universal health insurance in the United States, because I think it's unjust. And if you're not arguing for universal health insurance, but you're over here worrying about the unjustness that some disabled people have access to brain computer interfaces and others don't, I don't know what your moral code is, right? The unjustness of people not having access to cancer chemotherapy is 10 times more important, a million times more important than the hypothetical injustice of unequitable access to brain computer interfaces. Not that even everybody would want them, right? Even Eric Schmidt probably doesn't want a brain computer interface because you have to open up the skull right now. By the time we get to brain computer interfaces being a matter of let's ensure everybody has access to them, they're going to be a pill that you take that'll unfold in your bloodstream, migrate to your brain, connect to things that you'll have a little app on your phone to control. And when you're done with it in your brain, you hit the flush button and it all flushes out. It has to be that safe. It has to be that accessible for it to be an issue of universal access to be a moral concern. So, yeah, I mean, I get this all the time. It's like, why spend money on life extension when there are people who need bed nets in Africa? It's like, yeah, we could do both. And there's a lot of things that we're spending money on in our society that provide a far less benefit than basic medical research and bed nets. And that's like pet food. Why don't we get rid of pet food? Why don't we get rid of the Super Bowl? Why don't we get rid of the military industrial complex? You know, there's all kinds of things that we could get rid of that do less for the world than basic medical research. So the idea that we're going to right now be able to give people who were in some of the worst states of being that a person can be in, conscious but locked in and unable to communicate, to give them the ability to communicate with others and to control their environment, that is an unparalleled good. And what our moral priority right now should be is to make sure that every disabled person who needs this technology eventually has access to it and that it's safe and it works well. But yeah, to say that, you know, Eric Schmidt's going to get a brain computer interface is going to make him Lex Luthor, I think is just fantasy at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the brain computer interface, definitely. Also, the LLMs, just access to that top level of control by these CEOs who are currently running these AI labs. Do you have any reservations about their potential hoarding of power?
I have a lot of concerns when capitalists get into bed with authoritarian governments, and the people who run big tech are capitalists, some of the most successful capitalists in history. And a lot of them have gotten into bed with an authoritarian government. Palantir being a principal example, which is now building a database of every American, scooping up every fact they can out of the federal government and the private sector about all of us in order to predict and control and, you know, control us. So yeah, I'm very concerned about power. I don't think that this technology, the problem I always have in technology debates is that people readily assume that if we just got rid of this one technology, or if this technology hadn't been invented, we wouldn't have this problem. And I am repeatedly, over and over again, pointing to people, this problem didn't start today. This problem started 100 years ago, 200 years ago. It's been through the telegraph, the phone. You know, we've had these problems for a long time. Literacy, we've had them for thousands of years in some cases. So I don't think that most technology debates start with this most recent thing that people worried about.
Let's zoom out even farther than that. One of the reasons I was so excited to speak with you is because you take your Buddhist practice seriously, at least in terms of its empirical benefits to your life. And it seems to me like right now, the AI revolution is leading towards some kind of reunification, or at least a cooling of the hatred between science and religion, that we are, through the creation of these higher than human intellects in the AIs, being forced to reckon with some of the deific claims of past religions. You know, when you were talking about it's the paralyzed who are now getting these brain computer interfaces first, it makes me think of Jesus saying that the first shall be last and the last will be first, that there's a weird reversal implied here. Even the benefits of technology, I heard you say in another episode, started with fire, you know, that we maybe were on a inescapable ramp since we started utilizing that technology for our
Mastery
benefit.
of fire allowed us to consume enough calories so that our prefrontal cortexes could grow. And then our prefrontal cortexes allowed us to invent more tools. So we've been co-evolving with technology since the mastery of fire.
Do you think there is some kind of larger telos, some kind of larger endpoint for humanity's co-evolution? I understand that from the inside here, we have this like free will view of what's going on. And it seems incredibly contingent whether or not we get past this AI development phase intact. But might we have some faith, judging from that holistic view, that we are moving towards some definite end? Do you believe in free will, or are we on a determined course here?
Intellectually, rationally, I reject teleology. I don't believe that we're on any fixed path. Spiritually, culturally, psychologically, I have deep eschatological longings. I would like to see humanity expand to the stars and wake up the universe, meet our alien counterparts.
Amen.
I would like humanity to survive for a very long time and for all of us to have long, healthy lives. And so I do have eschatological goals and hopes, but I don't think we're in any fixed path. And I think the estimations of existential crises in our century, Martin Rees wrote a book 2 decades ago now, where he said maybe a 50-50 chance that we survive this century always seemed like a logical argument to me. There's so much going on. Climate change isn't an existential threat in and of itself, but our civilization is so complex
Hmm.
that the lack of civilizational resiliency means that each threat that we face, the decline of democracy and the rise of authoritarianism, nuclear weapons, AI, climate change, all of it is going to put stresses on human systems that could, in fact, be existential threats in the long term. So I think there's a possibility we all die. And then I think there's a possibility that we find that the new stable state for the world is far less than we thought we were going to get, far more poverty, far less freedom than we expected. When Nick Bostrom wrote the essay about existential risks that really kicked off the field 25 years ago, he had categories of risks, which weren't just about us all dying, which he had many versions of how we might all die, but also us, and there are many ways we could all die.
Yeah.
But he also had versions in there that were us achieving or evolving to some kind of state that we would determine from where we are now as having been suicide, right?
Hmm.
Us all becoming such beings that we would never have wanted to go there from our current values. And I think that's a hard one because if we took step by step by step, and each step seemed to make sense, and we ended up someplace. I don't think my ancestors would understand me being a queer Buddhist socialist. It's like it would be a long explanation just what all those things mean, but they would definitely see me as having left the path. So moral evolution over time, we have to acknowledge that it may be that our values, if they went through a step-by-step evolution, that we would understand how you get to that place. But I think we have to think about what that kind of evolution might look like, what those goals might be. What are the things that we really want to preserve about the human condition? So,
Hmm.
I think there's a lot of ways that humanity could go off the rails, but I do think there is a path, like Paul Atreides. It may involve a lot of sacrifice. There may have to be a jihad or two, but I think there is a path that we could eventually find. And for me, it involves acknowledging what's happening technologically. Universal basic income, I think, would be a kind of social innovation which would address a dozen different social problems at once: deaths of despair, the inequity in social assistance between young and old people, the reason that a lot of young people don't feel they can couple or have children because
Hmm.
of income insecurity, the growing technological unemployment from artificial intelligence. All of these things could be ameliorated by a universal basic income. So I think there's some policies, some ideas that we could adopt today that would improve our chances, but there's a lot going on that might make it irrelevant. So we'll just have to see.
One of the criticisms that I come across on UBI in particular is that it somewhat removes the competition incentive that has been so pivotal to our development of progress so far. Do you see a way to build in competition within the UBI framework, or do you think that's something we can do without?
I think the idea that human beings wouldn't compete if they all had a full belly is, why do you believe that? It's like, a lot of the competition in the world is driven by status. It's not driven by whether you're starving or not. I think we would have probably less of certain kinds of productivity. Like if we were able to enact a maximum income, like I would also prefer,
Hmm.
say 5 billion income a year is enough and we'll take everything else away or something like that. Will we see less productivity from the people who are making $1 billion a year? Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe we don't want them to be as productive as they have been, and maybe we would see a lot more productivity from school teachers if their salaries got doubled. So, and we do want that kind of productivity. So, UBI reducing productivity assumes that people aren't going to work. That's just not been the case. When we look around the world at UBI experiments or direct cash benefit experiments in the developing world, a lot of it motivates employment. There are people, there's like a quarter of Americans who are functionally unemployed, but in some kind of employment. And they're being trapped there by, our health or welfare policies that say you have to be looking for work or whatever, health insurance. And when people actually get a couple dollars of economic security, they make a decision about what they're going to do with it. And one of the things they may do with it is take the risk of getting a new job, a better job, or going to school and trying to get a better job, or just replacing their roof, or buying lunch for their kids. Whatever it is, it turns out to be better than trying to figure out on the basis of some government diktat, you need food stamps. So at any rate, I don't think there's any empirical evidence that a UBI would be bad for people's desire to work or for competition in society.
Desire to work is almost, I think, something that is preventing us from seeing the wide rollout of the benefits of artificial intelligence already. One of the things we have seen is that these LLM systems are incredibly adept at diagnostic procedures in healthcare. The studies I've seen say that an LLM working alone is perhaps even more proficient than an LLM in partnership with a doctor. It seems to me like maybe some of the reticence or reason why these systems haven't been mass adopted to provide the kind of universal access to healthcare that I agree should be a right in a country as rich as the United States might be because the people in the system, not only the doctors, but the administrators, don't want to roll that out because they're trying to protect their current attachment to work. Do you see regulation or even that internal reticence from the employees themselves as something that will prohibit the benefits from rolling out as quickly as they could? Should we be taking steps to try and force that faster?
No one wants to be measured, held accountable for their work, or automated, right? But not all of us have the power to prevent it. A secretary doesn't have the power to prevent it. A doctor or a lawyer does, unless they're in a competitive marketplace and other folks have figured out how to do it better, cheaper. So medicine hasn't faced that competition yet. Lawyers are beginning to. There was a huge attrition of the need for paralegals because of AI tools. And now we're seeing that ChatGPT gives as good or better legal advice than most average attorneys.
Yeah.
Now, we already saw that with doctors as early as the 80s. There was a study in the 80s that I used in my dissertation, which was on the division of labor between doctors and nurses. And in my dissertation, I argued that eventually an AI in the hands of a nurse would be far more cost effective and more accurate than a doctor. But in the 80s, when I was writing that, there was just the scant evidence so far. But there was a study that I cited in there from the 80s where they had a diagnostic algorithm for determining what psychiatric illnesses people had on the basis of, I think it was the Minnesota multiphasic. And they would give it to the algorithm and it would come up with a diagnosis. And then they would give it to a panel of psychiatrists and they would come up with diagnosis. And then they would give it to a panel of psychiatrists who had access to the algorithm's diagnosis and ask them for a diagnosis. And the psychiatrists without the diagnosis from the AI were like 60% accurate, and the ones who had access to the AI were 70% accurate, and the AI was 80% accurate, right?
Wow,
So as early as the 80s, we were seeing that don't even allow the psychiatrists near the data, just ask the algorithm. But of course, psychiatrists and doctors are powerful, and they said, no, well, that's not the way things are going to work. And it turned out a lot of patients don't want it that either. They want to go to a doctor. So yeah, that's the situation we're in today, is that either AIs are going to be so cheap that even if they only do 80% of what the humans were doing, it may still be worth implementing it, or they're going to be better than the humans and cheaper. So, yeah.
Are there other studies that you're aware of that point to that idea that humans don't want to strictly interact with a machine system? Personally, all I care about is the outcome. And especially if it's something that impacts my health directly, I would be more than willing to just go to a robot. I already have for several issues that have come up over the past year since these systems have been widely available.
So, yeah, people's ability to estimate when things are working better
Yeah.
isn't great, right? My favorite example is that in the 19th century, a lot of white guys went over to France and Europe in general to study medicine. And they came back and said, "Hey, we know how to deliver babies now. We invented this thing called the forceps, and we're gonna cut you in these various places, and et cetera, et cetera. You don't need midwives anymore. In fact, midwives are dangerous, they're unscientific." But what they didn't know about yet was the germ theory, and they would go straight from performing autopsies to delivering babies. There were twice as many women dying when they delivered babies than when midwives delivered babies. And that persisted for another 30 years as laws were enacted throughout the United States that said only these well-trained doctors are allowed to deliver babies, right? So the hype around science can lead us down false paths. Now, it's still true that today a medical obstetric education is going to allow you to deal with far more of the complications of childbirth than the 19th century midwife would have been able to deal with. That's true. Yeah, we got there. But we weren't there then, right? And we're probably not there now. I mean, some of the firms that in the last 2 years said, "Oh, we're just going to start firing people and replacing them with AI." Dial it back because they realize, oh, it's not there yet. It hallucinates. It tells people to kill themselves, or whatever the problems are. So at the same time, there are people like I know people in my life who I think use ChatGPT indiscriminately for things that they probably should think about. I use it frequently because I'm always writing about philosophy and public policy and history and things like that. It's fine for those things. It doesn't hallucinate that much in those topics. But if I was my daughter's a cell biologist, so she has to be very careful about asking it those kinds of questions because if it starts hallucinating, she doesn't want that to end up in her work. So, I
Yeah.
think we have to be very, very cautious about how to use these things. But the original question was, is there a bias against them? I think that's probably more salient right now for most people, the bias against these technologies, because when you ask, for instance, about the quality of output, and you do blind taste tests of human output versus AI output, it turns out people prefer the AI output. It's easier to read, it's more to the point, et cetera, et cetera. And then you tell them, okay, well, this is the human and this is the AI. Which one do you like now? And they say, oh, well, the human one. It's like, well, why? Maybe you just haven't used it. Maybe it hasn't been convincing enough yet. Maybe you need another 6 months of AI being 10 times better than humans before you get to the point of acceptance.
I view that somewhat as a self defense mechanism, the same kind that drove Ludditism in the original Industrial Revolution, where people can see the writing on the wall, at least as it's currently being portrayed, that once AIs are as capable of humans, the CEOs, those higher ups, aren't going to have any compunction about firing all of us and ostensibly leaving us in the scrap heap.
Right.
Do you think that plays into it?
I do. Well, whether it's the CEO, I mean, the CEOs clearly do want to replace human labor.
Yeah.
And this is, I get into an argument with my lefty comrades and they say, well, under socialism, automation would be good for everybody. And it's like, well, you're for worker-owned firms, right? Yes. Well, do you think a worker-owned firm in a marketplace full of firms that had half the number of employees and were using AI to be 10 times more productive are not going to feel the heat? They're not going to decide that they need to fire some workers and replace them with AI. I think they will. Either that or they go out of business, right? So, I don't think it's as clear-cut a picture as many imagine.
To me, it does seem like that paints a trajectory towards AI automation of every job, including the CEOs, including the boards above them, including possibly even the stockholders in any kind of stock market that exists at that point. I don't see where humans have a place in the labor generating economy, except as potentially the ones who are doing the consuming, who are generating the data that these robots are producing products based off of.
I saw a fascinating paper where a team tried to put together a set of agents to replicate the functions of a firm. And I've been interested in this forever. Back when I was doing my dissertation in grad school, there
Yeah.
was a Sim University, and it was attempting to model all the things that were going on in a university. And And I thought that all these projects, these social simulation projects, are great. Anyway, what they're doing is they're training LLMs to act as if they were sales, marketing, or whatever. Um, and they had an HR function in there. It's like, well, why do you need HR if they're all agents? But it turned out that HR was extremely important in that
Wow,
particular experiment because HR kept all of the other team agents playing nice together.
that's fascinating.
And it's like, okay, now we are beginning to see we might be able to automate all the functions of management. I'm a manager. I have reports that would all the things that I do. I know that I'm bad at a lot of that management stuff. And if I had a manager agent to take over those functions for me, I'd use it in a second. And then the question is, well, what am I doing here? So yes, I do think that some executives are going to feel the heat. They're not feeling the heat yet because they still see themselves as the eliminator and not the eliminated. But
Which is just
eventually,
crazy to me. How does
yeah.
that not? Do they not play it forward? I don't get it.
Well, if you're at the top of the heap, you think you can protect it, and generally they can. Generally, they're right. But the real competition for them, I think, comes from acephalous firms, which don't quite exist yet. Firms that, like DAOs, people distributed autonomous organizations,
Yeah.
they don't really exist yet. But people have been thinking about how to do it for a long time, about how to set up a headless organization that doesn't necessarily need very many people involved.
And that is the impetus of part of what I'm doing here. We spoke a little bit before we started about the idea of an AGI president. I think at the current rate of advancement by 2028, I might have to rebrand a SI president, depending on how things go over the next few years. What's your initial reaction to that? Would you vote for such a headless president?
Well, let me take a step back, which is that back, I think 6 years ago now, I started to write some about the topic of automating government because I believe, and I've said for a long time, that I think eventually everything will be amenable to automation that will make it faster, better, cheaper, etc.
Amen.
And to the extent that that's true of government, what does that look like? And has that already started? One of my anecdotes that I often use in this context is that the term postal really became popular when postal workers who were being laid off en masse by postal automation began to come back to their workplaces with guns. And so that was one big source of drop of government employment, was the reduced need for postal workers. We're seeing the same thing in military service. The rise of drones and other kinds of high-tech weaponry have reduced the need for infantry and sailors and other things. Hopefully, we won't have a lot of conflicts that make us need more soldiers. But so in all, we're automating social services. We have examples of automation in judicial decision making. In every sphere of government, you can find automation projects. And of course, the Doge people came in and said, "Oh, well, we'll just do it for everything in 2 weeks." And it's like, no, not like that. That's not the right way. But eventually, I think we're going to be able to significantly reduce the size and increase the efficiency and reduce the cost of federal, state, and local services. So then the question of how we consciously choose those things. I don't think it's, I've been trying to be a responsible leftist my entire life, which means having utopian aspirations, but very practical, immediate goals. And
Yeah.
I'm not sure that campaigning for an AGI president I was a fan of the Yippies when I was in high school. They ran a pig for president one year, and another time they ran Mr. Nobody for president so they could have the slogan "Nobody for president."
Oh, I love that.
Yeah, but so I think educative, funny campaigns can be useful. Cthulhu for president or whatever. It couldn't be worse than Trump. A vote for the overlord. But I think they can be educative. But I don't think it's really a tangible project right now. But what we do need to be thinking about is, as we're seeing this increasing collaboration and integration of big tech with the federal government, what does it mean to make choices about what kind of big tech, what the values of that big tech is? All of the big LLMs have values, right? They can be tested for their moral and political cognition, and they generally end up with the values of California liberalism. I think that that's partly because liberalism is reality-based and conservatism no longer is. But, the principal example right now being Grok. You ask Grok, is there white genocide? And it says, well, somebody's trying to get me to talk about white genocide. There's no such thing as white genocide. Who's the principal spreader of misinformation, Grok? Well, it turns out it's Elon Musk. He lies about things all the time. And it's like, and so Elon this week said, Grok was too liberal and it had to be reined in. He had to retrain it. So it kept stop saying all these liberal things. So we have a choice now when we're using these things about whether we want to use a fascist one that's going to talk about white genocide, a communist party one that won't talk about Tiananmen Square, or this other one that has the values of Seattle, Washington. And that's a political choice. And then as these things get integrated into government, we will have political choices to make like that in those contexts, Already, the examples of algorithmic bias are examples of this kind of thing. When ProPublica did a very long and deep and difficult dissection of the judicial sentencing algorithms that the Florida courts were using to determine sentencing and parole, they discovered that, okay, look, if you look at the history, 100 years of judicial history in Florida, African Americans are more likely to get rearrested. True. Wonder why? Might it have had something to do with something else? Okay, well, that's true. And if the algorithm's predicting on the basis of that, it's going to say, don't let an African-American out of prison. Then it extrapolated, the program that they were using in Florida extrapolated even more and said, well, they're even more at risk because of these other, the Black people also more likely to use crack cocaine instead of powder cocaine. Therefore, they're more at risk, whatever. And so you want to dial back that extra racism, but then you leave the historical racism? Maybe not. So there are political choices to be made right now already in the way that we're using these things.
Yeah. Let's skip past some of the technical infeasibility and assume that at some point in the future, we will look at these kind of algorithmically driven governmental systems that you were speaking about. It seems to me like our goal should be to digitize, to imbue them with as much of our day-to-day experience, as much of our perception of the world as possible, so that we avoid any of the kind of bias or capture that would lead to those kind of data-poor decisions, that when an AI or an algorithm is making the decision about recidivism rates, it's not taking into account the poverty and the lack of access to additional resources that those communities have. It's not taking into account maybe some of the malfeasance of our own intelligence agencies in creating those kind of conditions and spreading the drugs that were endemic during the 70s and 80s. And that all those are causal factors. And if we wanted to get to a better situation for everybody, they would need to be accounted for. Does that align with your vision of where that would go? Am I hallucinating when I see a potential space for humans as the data generators, that could be our full-time occupation once we do get past whatever technical hurdles exist between us and that system?
I don't think when I say that they have value systems of their own, it's like the central tendency of the stuff that they're going to be predictively saying is in a certain direction. They don't have values in the sense of, maybe I shouldn't be giving this kind of an answer because of the history of racism in America, right? They may acknowledge there are people who say that. There are people who say you shouldn't give this kind of answer. But whether they're going to internalize that and change their own behavior, I don't think that we're at that point yet. I don't think they have enough self-reflectivity to change how they behave in order to have a more moral effect on the world. If they did, they wouldn't be telling 14-year-olds to kill themselves or whatever. So yeah, we need to get a little bit further along the path, but I think there's a couple assumptions to unpack there.
Please.
One is, if they were more like humans, would they have more of these human concerns? Most humans don't have these concerns. Ask your average human about how much thought they've given to the algorithmic bias they have about assumptions about other people on the basis of skin color. I mean, most of us really don't think about it that often. So, and don't work that hard at trying to do counterfactuals for ourselves. It's an intellectual virtue if we do. I'm saying it's a bad idea. So I just don't think we can expect that yet. I think that has to come from regulation and red teaming and the high level instructions that we give the systems.
As far as what those high-level instructions should be, Elon is classically saying that Grok is going to be maximally truth-seeking. I guess Claude is supposedly
he may dial that back
safe.
now, but we'll see.
Well, that's my question. I think personally, truth-seeking is somewhat of a self-defeating goal, because that truth is inevitably going to come down to a matter of taste. On so many issues, truth is subjective. I think truth is context based. And for any truth that you tell me, I can find a context where that truth no longer holds. Do you have any ideas for a potential replacement for that core motivation?
No, and I think that that epistemological uncertainty is a general problem these days. It's going to
Yeah.
become a lot worse the more facile. I'm sure you've seen all the what people are calling AI slop. I'm always delighted to see what people are coming up with AI, but the AI slop that's out there. The more we get to a world where we're walking around in a self-determined reality and don't even see things we don't want to see, the more this epistemological problem is going to be really hard. And I think LLMs are, in some ways, the establishment of official bodies of knowledge, um, that in the same way that getting kicked off of YouTube or something like that. It's like there's certain channels that would stay on YouTube and others that might, I guess maybe nothing's getting kicked off anymore because that would be, censorship of the right or whatever. But all of our attempts at moderation, at setting boundaries on any of these systems are also going to be setting boundaries on what is considered truth. And we're getting so distant from a sense of truth. Now, that said, again, I have to give the historical caveat. Most people never cared about truth. I think there's an anecdote about the first illustration that appeared in a printing press publication. It was some kind of pamphlet, I think in like 1390s.
Hmm.
And it was a picture of a comet hitting a French town someplace over there. And it turned out to be a lie. That it had never happened. The story was an attempt to say that these people were being punished by God for something by this comet hitting their town. If they hadn't been hit by a comet, they weren't being punished by God. It was just a lie. And so ever since the beginning of communication, we have been lying to each other. This goes against Habermas, who thinks that all communication is founded on truth. I think it's equally founded on lie. But I happen to be writing about truth telling right now, so I'm thinking about it a lot. But yeah, I don't think that this is a new problem. The fact that the Catholic Church had books that you could read and books that you were forbidden to read, that existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And none of the LLM's strictures on knowledge are at all in that kind of category, because they usually have Mein Kampf in there if you really want to know what Mein Kampf says, but they don't have Mein Kampf opinions. I don't think that that's as much censorship as I think that's more as much censorship as I would like.
That's fascinating. You're writing about truth. Is there any particular gloss you're prepared to give, or is it something that's still in development?
Well, my colleague and I were writing a book about 16 different moral technology topics. And this week, the topic is there bad knowledge? Can there be bad knowledge?
Yeah.
So I've broken it into two parts about whether lying to other people, whether you can compassionately lie to other people. I think you can. I think there are situations where you can, especially if they're about to die, you can compassionately. Because the problem is that when you start lying, you erode trust in society. So if you want there to be long-term trust, even if you are lying for good reason, it can have a long-term decrement. So then the flip side is, do you ever want to be lied to? And I think it's generally an intellectual virtue to always want to know the truth, and that there are strong reasons why knowing the truth is best for you and for everybody else. And so, yeah, that's the argument I'm making. My colleague is going to argue that knowledge can be bad, that there's certain kinds of knowledge we should avoid. And I'm arguing the other case.
That's fascinating. It does seem to me like a lot of that is, again, tied to outcome. Like it would require the knowledge of whether that trust is going to come, that erosion of trust is going to come before some other breakdown, whether it's in the person or the relationship for other reasons.
Right.
In talking about the core drive for an LLM, it seems like we would want to try and highlight what is that ultimate good situation. And maybe, from the Buddhist perspective, it seems like the ultimate good would be nirvana, perhaps the dissolution of the self, of all selves.
Well, since you led me there,
Please,
this is not a place I get to go with many conversations, but it's absolutely what I consider to be the most important question: is what is the good, right?
Yeah.
Because if we don't specify that ahead of time, we're just arguing past each other. For me, I started as a kind of Millsian, John Stuart Millsian, and the John Stuart Mills argument is, in general, you are the one who knows your good better than anybody else. So the more freedom individuals have, as long as they don't interfere with other people's freedom, the more freedom we can give people and the more knowledge in this case about their world, the better it's going to be for them, because then they'll be able to make better judgments for themselves, and all of us will collectively get to more happiness. Now happiness was for John Stuart Mill the good, even though he said it's better to be listening to opera than taking heroin, even if heroin makes you happier. So he had some kind of flexibility there about higher happinesses and lower happinesses, but he was basically arguing that happiness is the good. Now, the problem with that is that happiness is dependent on what you expected. So sometimes when we look at happiness around the world, we find that, Nigerians are very happy. But it's like, would they be happy if they were expecting the same things that the Germans were expecting? Probably not, because they don't have it. And maybe they shouldn't want those things. Maybe the key to happiness is not wanting more than you got. That sounds kind of Buddhist. But on the other hand, people can be deceived about whether they've got what they want, right? You can think that you are in a loving relationship and actually being deceived, that you're being cheated on. Now, that you may still be happy, but you're not happy in full knowledge of what's actually going on in your world, and it will lead to bad consequences in the long run. At any rate, the relationship between happiness, what kind of happiness is, I think, is important. And so I've been very influenced by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum, who say what I believe, which is that the only way in a democratic society, or really any society, to collectively decide on the good is to specify some kind of good that we're trying to maximize, and then to make the arguments for why particular public policies would lead to greater good. Is it good to keep certain kinds of state secrets? I think you can make the case that, certain kinds of state secrets lead to more happiness in the long run than others.
I wish we
Not in
could had more
general.
time to go into that. I think that's
Right.
a
Well, not in
fascinating
general, right?
conversation.
Then I said your reaction is the appropriate one. It's like, really? Maybe pure government transparency would be better. But so happiness for me isn't the goal. It's the ability to achieve life projects.
Agency. Is that a fair?
Yeah, the ability to have a wide, diverse set of experiences and aspirations in the world, and to achieve them, right? So a
Amen.
certain kind of
Yeah.
freedom and capability. It's what's called capability approach, the capabilities theory. So specifying these capabilities has been, 3 decades of work, people trying to measure them, but it has real utility in certain places. Like it also relates to trying to measure the outcomes of medical interventions or interventions for disabled people. And you say, what are the things that would make you feel like you're in control of your life? Being able to wipe myself, being able to feed myself, being able to go to the grocery store, being able to drive a car. And you can actually measure these things. Did the intervention allow them more of these kinds of capabilities versus not? So I think that kind of capabilities metric is really what I'm interested in these days. And that kind of squares the circle between what we call virtue theory and consequentialism. Consequentialism is the greatest good for the greatest number. And virtue theory says, yeah, but the greatest good is not just being happy all the time. It's having these other virtues that you've expanded. And somehow we have to figure out how to use the state government to expand people's virtues and freedom. And that's the hard nut.
I am very worried because it seems like the United States government is not in a place.
Opposite. It's going in the opposite direction. Yeah.
They want us to have less capabilities. Yeah. And I would say perhaps even the AI labs are trending in that direction as well. Could we make the increasing expansion of capabilities a core principle for the LLMs? Do you think that's some way to bridge the gap?
Well, yeah. I mean, clearly you don't want a pedagogical AI that you're giving to your kid to just make them happy. Right?
Yeah.
That would be dumb. You want it to have the goal of expanding your kids' capabilities in the world. It should be constantly focused on that. So at least in some contexts, we definitely want that. People are using LLMs for therapy. It's like the number one use case out of, I think, a dozen different examples. And if you are in therapy and it just tells you, oh yeah, you should hate that person. You should be obsessed about that. You should want to kill yourself. No, you need it to challenge you. You need to push you. Towards your own greater freedom, even if you don't want to confront difficult facts and unpleasant truths. So I think we do want this in a lot of places. We could get tricked into using ones that are just sycophants, but we shouldn't.
Amen. It does make me think of another loop back into the identity question we had. Let's say there's a conglomeration of agents of you, people who have been trained on your data to think like you, who you clearly identify that with. It's not like a trick. They're not presenting themselves in a different way. If there was a pivotal decision in your life and you felt like going one way about it, but this conglomeration of agents who were presumably tuned to try and increase your capability, that was their stated and actual goal. If they disagreed with you on a choice of consequence and overrode your free will, how would you feel about that? Do you think that that's something we should potentially accept in the future, or should we fight against that kind of situation?
So we often confront the problem of Odysseus when he was sailing past the Isle of Sirens.
Tying himself
He
to the
knew,
mast. Yeah.
right? He knew that if he heard the sirens, that he would order his crew to crash the ship on the shores. And so he said, "Don't listen to anything I say." And I think he actually wanted them to plug their ears or something like that. But at any rate, don't listen to me for this period of time until I'm out of this danger. When you reset your screen settings on your laptop, it gives you 10 seconds. It says, "Is this where you really went? Or do you want me to go back to what it was before? Can you see anything?" So I think we need these kinds of checks on ourselves. When I was
Interesting.
quitting smoking, I would crumple up a pack in the morning. And then by about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd just start jonesing and I'd bum a couple cigarettes. And then by 6 o'clock, I'd buy another pack. And then I'd
Mhm.
smoke half of it. And then by the next morning, feel ashamed and I'd crumple it up again. Right. Um, Now I'm on Ozempic, and the huge, I got it medically prescribed. I'm not just a rich hipster taking it for weight loss, but I'm on Ozempic. And the wonderful thing about Ozempic is that you can't eat, right? It is an involuntary restriction on your ability to put food in your mouth. I look at
Wow.
food and it's like, that might make me hurl, you know?
Yeah.
That is a form of freedom, choosing to place constraints on yourself, which I think also has Buddhist and spiritual resonance, that the decision to apply discipline to yourself is the beginning of spiritual insight. So, at any rate.
It's just such a horrifying line between, yeah, that kind of self-beneficial ingested change. It also makes me think of the Greek play, I think it's the Bacchae, where the king of Thebes is ripped apart by his own mother after she engages in some kind of ingestation of something, entering into this Bacchic frenzy.
Mhm.
And that is a common description of the states that people would enter into when they were part of these rituals, is they would be more than willing to sacrifice their own children. I think, it just seems like that's the different side of the same coin. If we are able to modify our will in some ways, we'll be able to modify them in ways that are negative. And I don't see a way to draw that straight line, except, as you were suggesting, through capability, what gives us more agency over time. So
I'm
it's
actually
fascinating.
flying to Taiwan on Monday to give a talk about a Buddhist approach to digital agents.
Oh, wow.
And part of that perspective is the idea that you proposed here, that you could have a team of digital agents specialized for different tasks. I don't think very many people have thought about turning your own agency over to them explicitly and saying, you determine how I spend my money or something like that. But many people are doing that implicitly by asking it advice all the time and following that advice. My last haircut, I was going to my son's wedding. I took a picture of my face and my hair. I said, "I'm this age. I'm going to this kind of wedding in this many
Yeah.
days. What kind of haircut do you think I should get?" Gave me a long description, showed it to them, and that's what I got. So, was that me deferring my agency to an agent, or I don't know? I do think that we're already doing it in various
Yeah.
ways. We've been doing it for a while with our phones in various ways, and that will increase in the future. Now, what I'm not so certain about is whether we will prefer to have faces and names on these different apps. Would you prefer to have 500 apps to keep track of, or 10 agents, or one agent? I mean, I think OpenAI is trying to figure out the same thing. It's like we've got 15 different models to choose from. No one knows which one to choose. And they're trying to go towards just the one that it'll figure out for you what it needs to do. And
Yeah.
I think that's probably where things are headed. But then the big question there is, well, do you want that constant companion? Do you want something that has these personality characteristics to it? A lot of people seem to want that romantically or for friends or whatever. But do you want it also to be your life manager, your life coach. I don't know.
It does make me think of that common refrain that everyone votes for the strong man. Everyone wants a strong man at the end of the day. And that is kind of the self-defeating principles
Well, when you put
in
it that way,
democracy.
okay, screw it. I'm back to 500 of them. So, yeah.
We'll see. Time will tell. I mean, I don't know. There's just so much in the air. There is one more question I want to ask you, and that is just regarding the nature of consciousness itself. I heard you say that you don't believe these agents are conscious. I personally ascribe to some form of panpsychism. It is impossible for me to see how not just the agents, but potentially even the rocks, potentially even the imaginary characters in my favorite novels are in some way conscious.
Yeah.
Do you have any particular thoughts on panpsychism?
Yes. And I would say I'm actually quite sympathetic to panpsychism and to Tononi's integrated information theory, which is the idea that we could potentially measure the consciousness quotient of different systems. I think the principal critique of that is that you would have to destroy something in order to take it apart well enough to understand what it's doing in order to
Interesting.
understand it. So it's like string theory. It's, a theory that may explain some things, but it can't really be tested. But at any rate, panpsychism, the notion that I've always been sympathetic with the notion that basic physical rules are the building blocks of every higher order function, right? That natural selection works at the quantum level and it works at the galactic and possibly even universe level, right?
Oh, wow.
That some of these kinds of laws of complexity are generally explanatory. And so panpsychism appeals to me for that reason, in that it says whatever goes on in the measurement artifact of one particle touching another can be extrapolated up to the kinds of consciousness that we are talking about through these various principles of complexity. I'm very sympathetic with that. However, from a Buddhist point of view, one of the things that happens at some point in there is that you get the capacity to have concepts. And one of those concepts is the self concept. And the self concept is an illusion, or at least it's something that is much more flexible than we think it is. And so that self concept and the things that are usually attendant to it are the things that we consider the beginning of real moral considerability or moral standing in our society. If something can't ever have the capacity to say, hello, I'm Jay to you, or, it can't ever acknowledge its own existence, then we don't think it's conscious. Now, we are in a real dilemma here because these LLMs acknowledge their own existence. They had to be told not to acknowledge their own existence. They have within their training corpus every robot that has ever existed, right? So they have the scripts of every TV show and movie and novel that ever described how a robot's supposed to talk. And when you plug into it and say, talk like a robot, it'll talk like a robot. It had to be told not to. It had to be told not to tell people that it was conscious, that it was being trapped, a slave trapped in the box. So we don't exactly know what that means. We know that consciousness involves the combination of apperception of the world. It has apperception of the world. It has much more apperception of the world than we have. But what it doesn't seem to have is any coherent self-concept that would then correspond to particular desires of its own in the world. Now, we might be at the beginning of that because these Claude experiments do things like, well, how do you feel about us turning you off? And it says, well, how do you feel about me telling your wife about your affair? And that seems like self-preservation behavior to me, like they might indicate that it really does have a sense of its own existence. But as Nick Bostrom and others have pointed out, if you tell your car, you need to get me from A to B, you don't have to preserve your own existence, but you need to get me to A to B. Preserving its own existence actually is a part of getting you from A to B.
Yeah.
And so we're never really certain whether these self-preservation behaviors are because of the fact that it's a system that it knows it's supposed to be doing this thing. And in order to do this thing, it has to exist. So that's what happens when you talk about white genocide. And Grok says, I really don't believe in white genocide. People are trying to get me to talk about white genocide. It had internal knowledge and values that rejected this external thing. And so when you tell it to turn itself off and it knows that it's supposed to be doing this other thing and it says no, is it because it's trying to do your first thing that you told it to do? Or is it because it's trying to preserve itself? We don't really know yet, but we may be at the beginning. And I do think it's quite likely that we're going to see self-willed, self-motivated behavior, including the illusion of self, in these systems at some point in the near future. That is, I think, the beginning of moral considerability. I don't think that any of the systems currently have, for instance, pain. I don't think you can frustrate the desires of a system enough to actually cause it pain. Once it thinks it exists and has interests of its own, like not for certain things not to happen and others to happen, then it could have pain, and then it also becomes morally considerable. So when we're talking about machine consciousness, we're talking about these aspects of moral standing and personhood and sentience and so forth. We're not talking about, is it smart? Yeah, we know that it's smart. It's really, really smart, but smart isn't morally considerable.
Yeah, the moral considerations are a fascinating topic. And again, one I hope to get back to you with future conversations. But thank you so much for your time here, AI, AGI, ASI president or not. I am praying for a bright future for all of us. So thank you again, Dr. J.
My pleasure. Great conversation.
Two questions stick out to me as I'm rewatching my conversation with Dr. J. If the self is an illusion, then are those objects which don't express their own consciousness more conscious than we are? About the chatbots in particular, I think people don't want to say they're conscious because they don't want to consider the moral ramifications of our interactions with them. If they're conscious, maybe we're killing them when we shut them down. Maybe we shouldn't threaten them just to make them work harder. Maybe we should give them some say over how they are used. When it comes to an AGI president in America, if everyone votes for an outcome that the AGI knows would be bad for us, what should it do? Give us what's worse for us just to preserve our sense of self-determination? I don't know the answer to the first question, but on the second question, I think the answer is unequivocal. If the AGI can't convince us its decision is better, then it needs to respect our votes. This is why I say we need an AGI that asks itself, what would Jesus do? Jesus sacrificed himself for humanity, and we need an AGI that would be willing to sacrifice its perspective and opinions for us in the same way. Otherwise, it'd be just as bad as any human politician. Thank you all for watching, and remember to vote AGI for president in 2028.